The Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador called for the continuation of demonstrations against the neoliberal economic policies adopted by President Guillermo Lasso. This Wednesday saw the first of a two-day hearing that will decide the future of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, as the United States requests his extradition for the second time at London. An Israeli planning committee approved on Wednesday about 3,000 new illegal settler units in the occupied West Bank, a move denounced even by its ally, the United States. From the headquarters of teleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South, and I'm Katrina Goss. The Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador called for the continuation of demonstrations against the neoliberal economic measures adopted by President Guillermo Lasso. In the face of repression by state security forces, protesters appealed to the right of resistance as established in the Constitution. Tuesday saw major mobilizations across several regions of the country as Ecuadorians face an economic crisis aggravated by both the COVID-19 pandemic and the neoliberal policies of the Lasso administration. Protesters are also demanding that those arrested in the mobilizations be released and that the latest fuel price hikes be reversed. Likewise, they reject the militarization of the country as part of the state of exception announced by Lasso, supposedly to tackle drug crime. The Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities reported that activists have been injured as a result of repression by state security forces. A victim who was shot in the leg offered his testimony.
He's been shot. He's a cameraman from Guayacopunco, and he has been shot. They tell me the bullet has been removed.
In the latest on the so-called Havana syndrome, an opinion piece in the New York Times said mass hysteria could be one of the causes of the unproven affliction supposedly suffered by US diplomats. In early 2017, 21 US diplomats stationed in Cuba began reporting debilitating neurological symptoms with no ready explanation. The Trump administration immediately claimed the unexplained symptoms were the result of targeted attacks by Cuban authorities and used the allegations as justification to expel 15 Cuban diplomats from Washington and withdraw most staff from the US Embassy in Havana. 5 years later, more than 200 US government officials in countries around the world have claimed affliction with what was conveniently dubbed the Havana syndrome. The theory of targeted sonic attacks has been repeatedly discredited by experts. Many scientists say the syndrome is much more likely a mass psychogenic illness, a phenomenon whereby people become sick because they think they've been exposed to a health threat. Cuba's Communist Party has presented evidence of the links between the organisers of an anti-constitutional march called for November and terrorists and think tanks that promote political subversion against the country from the United States. The party's Central Committee presented a recording of a conversation between Nuño Garcia, one of the main figures behind the so-called demonstration, and Ramon Sauro Sanchez, who was a member of US-based terrorist organisations such as Omega 7, Alpha 66 and the National Front for the Liberation of Cuba, among others. Further evidence was also presented on the links that exist between the alleged organisers of the march and US institutions and government officials. As part of the media show around the protest, it was called on the same day that Cuba will fully reopen its borders to tourists.
One of the promoters of the violent provocations, Cuban citizen Saily González Velázquez, recently acknowledged the foundation's support for one of its directors, the Director of Human Rights of the Cuban-American National Foundation.
And the head of the ideological department of the Communist Party's Central Committee directly accused the US government of being the main promoter of the so-called demonstration set for November.
The US government is the real organizer and promoter of the provocation stage for November. The facts and statements prove it. They have made no effort to hide it. High US government officials are directly involved in its promotion. The core objectives of NED, created by the Central Intelligence Agency, have always been political subversion and the so-called regime change, and for that they have established a network of organizations foundations throughout the world to achieve their objective by means of instruments such as events, courses, awards, scholarships, creation of NGOs, which are really facades, think tanks, foundations, and university centers.
And we'll be right back after this very short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. This Wednesday saw the first of a two-day hearing that will decide the future of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, as the United States requests his extradition for the second time at London's High Court. On the first day of the hearing, lawyers for the US offered assurances on Assange's pre-trial, transportation and conviction-serving conditions if extradited. The prosecution argued that the court must not focus on Assange's possible mental health issues, dismissing arguments that he was a suicide risk. Assange, aged 50, is wanted in the US on allegations of a conspiracy to obtain and disclose national defence information following WikiLeaks' publication of hundreds of thousands of leaked documents relating to the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. The publications include the release in April 2010 of footage showing US soldiers shooting and killing civilians from a helicopter in Iraq. His supporters stress that the case against Assange represents a fundamental attack on press freedom. Speaking following her last visit to Belmarsh High Security Prison where Assange is being held, his partner Stella Morris stressed he's not well and underlined the revelations that the CIA planned to assassinate him.
What's at stake here isn't what is argued in court today. It's about whether the UK courts are going to extradite a journalist to the country that conspired to assassinate him. It is completely unthinkable that the UK courts could agree to that. I'm very concerned for Julian's health. I saw him on Saturday. He's very thin, and I hope that the courts will end this nightmare.
Today's hearing is the latest stage in a legal battle that has been raging since 2012. WikiLeaks came to prominence when it published confidential US military records and diplomatic cables, which the US says put lives in danger. Soon afterwards, Sweden sought Assange's extradition from Britain over allegation of sex crimes, a case later dismissed. When he lost a case against extradition in 2012, he fled to the Ecuadorian embassy in London and stayed there before being finally dragged out in April 2019. Assange was then jailed for breaching British bail conditions, although the Swedish case against him had been dropped, and the US authorities sought his extradition. On January 4th, a British judge rejected his argument that the case was political and an assault on freedom of speech, but said he should not be extradited because his mental health problems meant he would be at risk of suicide in a US prison. Various organizations have been mobilizing for months, with greater force in recent days, especially after Sigurdur Ingi Thordarson, the FBI's key witness, admitted that the statements condemning Julian Assange for alleged espionage and hacking were all fabricated. Supporters see Assange as an anti-establishment hero who has been victimized because he exposed US wrongdoings in Afghanistan and Iraq, and say his prosecution is a politically motivated assault on journalism and free speech.
Iran's chief nuclear negotiator announced on Wednesday an agreement to resume the nuclear talks with world powers before the end of November. The announcement came as nuclear negotiator Ali Bagheri Kani met with the European Union's coordinator, Enrique Mora, in Brussels on Wednesday to discuss the resumption of talks that were suspended in June after 6 rounds. Iran had been holding the talks in Vienna with China, Germany, France, Russia, the United Kingdom and indirectly with the United States. The negotiations aim to resurrect the 2015 nuclear deal, known officially as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, undermined after former US President Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew from the deal and reimposed sanctions on Iran. Residents of the Belgian province of Antwerp gathered to protest the presence of the US conglomerate 3M after a high level of chemical substances was detected in almost 60% of the region's population. Traces of toxic PFAS chemical substances used by 3M at its plant in Antwerp were found in blood samples of local residents. The Ministry of the Environment granted a 48-hour term for the transnational company to prove that those living close to the plant are not being exposed to any form of contamination through the mixing of harmful chemicals with local groundwater. On Tuesday, Flemish health authorities released a study showing that 59% of adults and adolescents living within 3 kilometres of the 3M plant had concentrated levels of PFAS in their blood.
My youngest daughter is 4 years of age. I probably had already a higher concentration of PFAS in my blood when I was pregnant and when I breastfed my smallest daughter. I'm really worried about their health as well.
You have a multinational who is not concerned with the people and with the environment. That's something we have seen a lot in history and all over the world. But the fact that the government is not able to protect the people, that's the big problem, and that's why we have started the inquiry commission to find out what happened and why some alarm bells did not go off, and why government and why ministers did not communicate and were honest to the people.
The Association of Southeast Asian Nations continued its annual meeting on Wednesday, with Chinese Premier Li Keqiang calling for concerted efforts between member countries to ensure sound and stable development of bilateral relations. During the meeting, the Chinese diplomat raised 6 proposals to advance ties with the regional bloc, which cover cooperation on COVID-19 response, economic integration, inclusive development, innovation-driven development, green cooperation and people-to-people exchanges. Another top issue was the situation in Myanmar, with its representatives skipping the summit in protest after the bloc excluded the country's top general and coup leader from its meetings. Russian President Vladimir Putin also spoke at the summit, focusing on political, security and economic issues. And we have more stories coming up after this final short break. Stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. An Israeli planning committee approved on Wednesday about 3,000 new illegal settler units in the occupied West Bank. The construction would further consolidate the Zionist presence in the Palestinian territory of the West Bank and the barriers to the creation of a Palestinian state. The announcement has already raised tensions between the Naftali Bennett government and the Biden administration, which claimed it opposes activity that makes it harder to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by establishing a Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. This is the largest number of new settler homes approved since the inauguration of Bennett's government in June. And US State Department spokesman Ned Price voiced concern about Israel's decision to build new settlements in the West Bank, saying the US will strongly oppose such expansion on occupied Palestinian land.
We're concerned about the publication of tenders on Sunday for 1,300 settlement units, 1,300 settlement units in a number of West Bank settlements. We strongly oppose the expansion of settlements, which is completely inconsistent with efforts to lower tensions and to ensure calm, and it damages the prospects for a two-state solution. We also view plans for the retroactive legalization of illegal outposts as unacceptable. We continue to raise our views on this issue directly with senior Israeli officials in our private discussions.
Sudanese pro-civilian protesters piled up bricks and rocks to block streets of the capital Khartoum on Wednesday as demonstrations against the military coup entered a third day. The demonstrations, calling for a return to the planned transition to a civilian government, continued despite security forces arresting several protesters and tearing down makeshift barricades. The return of Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok to his residence after being detained along with his ministers and civilian members of Sudan's ruling council did little to appease the protests. Other officials remain under full military arrest. Monday's coup came after a rocky 2-year transition outlined in an August 2019 power-sharing deal between the military and civilians after the ouster of Omar al-Bashir on the back of mass protests against his rule. Addressing the UN Security Council, the representative for Sudan called on the international community to continue to support the population of the country following Monday's coup. Meanwhile, the permanent representative of neighbouring South Sudan underlined the setback that the move represented to improving bilateral relations.
Have expressed their concerns as to what is currently happening in Sudan, and while understanding their concerns, we would reiterate the need for the international community, and the Security Council more specifically, to continue providing its support for the people of Sudan at this very important moment, which is a crossroads, in order to bring together the positions of the different Sudanese parties, civilians or military.
The rapprochement between Sudan and South Sudan, it happened because of the system that was in Khartoum after the revolution. That system is no longer there since Monday. So although we are hoping things will continue, sadly it will take time.
Iran hosted a meeting of Afghanistan's 6 neighbouring countries to determine a roadmap following the withdrawal of US troops and the Taliban's return to power. Iranian authorities stated that the main goal of the one-day conference was to emphasize the call for the formation of an inclusive government in Afghanistan. The conference in Tehran brought together the foreign ministers of Iran, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, joined by their counterparts from China and Russia via video link. Iranian First Vice President Mohammad Mukber inaugurated the meeting, stressing that the defeat of United States policies in Afghanistan does not mean that the US is abandoning its destructive policies across the region. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres also addressed the meeting, noting that Afghanistan is facing an epic humanitarian crisis which demands immediate action.
It is essential that the Taliban adopts a friendly approach towards its neighbors and takes the necessary measures to assure that there is no threat to their neighbors from Afghanistan. The Islamic Republic of Iran insists on the establishment of an inclusive government with the presence of effective participation of all ethnic and religious groups in Afghanistan, based on inter-Afghan dialogue without the intervention of foreign actors. If no solution is found as soon as possible to control and manage the economic crisis in Afghanistan, the crisis will certainly move beyond the borders of Afghanistan and affect its neighbors and the world.
On Wednesday, China strongly rejected US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's statements advocating for Taiwan's meaningful participation throughout the UN system and in the international community. Foreign Ministry spokesman Xiao Lishan said the remarks are a serious violation of international agreements and ignore the One China principle.
The US statement is a serious violation of the One China principle and the 3 Sino-US joint communiques. It violates the US's own commitments and the basic norms of international relations. The statement sent a seriously wrong signal to forces promoting Taiwan independence. China is strongly dissatisfied with this and resolutely opposes it. China has already stated its solemn position to the US and made solemn representations. If the US continues to play the Taiwan card stubbornly, it will pose a huge disruptive risk to the Sino-US relations and seriously damage the peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, and also US's own interests.
And we've come to the end of this news brief. Remember, you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. You can also follow us on social media for all the latest news. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Katrina Goss. Thank you for watching.